Hey guys, and welcome back to the Armchair Dragoons digital convention. And we're going to do another interview today. I'm Mo from Mo's Game Table, and joining me is Bruce Maxwell, the designer of the upcoming game NATO, The Cold War Goes Hot, which is going to be published by Compass Games. And welcome to the show, Bruce. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we had a conversation several weeks ago, about a 2.5-hour conversation, which was awesome. I wish we had recorded it because it was such a great chat that we had. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion here today as well, because I know we're going to have a great bunch of questions from the audience, because everyone is really looking forward to NATO to come back out. This is not just a reprint. This isn't even a reprint of the original game from '83. This is a rework. This is a whole new monster on its own. And by monster, I don't mean giant monster game, but it is a monster of its own in its own right. But let's talk about briefly first off, the changes that people can expect from the original to this new one.
Let me begin, if I may, by making a somewhat iconoclastic statement. I never liked the original game.
Mm-hmm.
It was rushed to market. The rules were an experiment by the editor. It was not my finest foot forward. It's spoken like a true perfectionist, but there was a story behind that, which was that the SPI design team had just left their sinking ship because SPI had gone bust. And so the rump of the design team was successful in convincing Avalon Hill to open up a new subsidiary, which we now know as Victory Games. And so I got a call from Mark Herman, who said, look, I got lots of game ideas, but I got nothing in the pipeline, and Avalon Hill would like to see some revenue in the next 6 months. You know, we have to hit the market here. So what do you got? Remember that NATO game that you were working on? How fast could you get that to market? And foolish me, I really wanted to be a designer, and I really wanted to go through the window that this opportunity represented. And I had worked at SPI, but I'd always been a developer. So I opened my big fat mouth and I said, I can get it ready in 30 days. Silly me. So I had a full-time job. So I worked 10-hour days at my full-time job. Then I went and worked 10-hour days at home on NATO and slept 4 hours a night for 30 days in a row and got the game in. But I didn't like it. It was a simplistic system. The thing I liked least about it was that the way the locking ZOCs worked, you would put super stacks 3 hexes apart with 2 intervening hexes that interlocked so that nobody could get through. And even though each hex is 15 miles across, and so a 30-mile open plain 2 hexes wide would exist between 2 cities, the Soviets had to dig NATO out of those 2 cities to exploit that 30-mile gap in the lines.
Yeah.
It really torqued me at how unrealistic it was. In my own mind, it produced a game that resembled World War I as a kind of classic war of attrition than modern mobile combat. Where was the maneuvering? Where was the cut and slash? Where was the backhand blow? And none of the things I associate with modern warfare were present. And so when Compass Games called up and said, hey, we'd like to republish the game, I was like, okay, I could do a better job this time. So I kept, the map has been substantially updated with satellite photography, but it is the same map. The movement system is the same as the original game. And that was a fairly simple and robust movement system that covered all dimensions of not just ground movement, but also march and air transport and power drops and amphibious action and port-to-port movement, and all pretty simple. I like that. Combat system, all gone. The units, completely done. And the first thing was that I knew I wanted to make ZOCs really porous. If you leave a 30-mile gap of open plain in your line, count on me sending a combined arms army right through that gap. So once I made ZOCs extremely porous, NATO didn't have enough forces at the divisional level to cover every hex. So I had to break the pieces down into brigades. once I did that, the Soviets had the ability to mass quite a few divisions against 1 or 2 brigades. So I did something that I've always wanted to do. I introduced a mechanic called reaction, and it allows NATO units to concentrate sideways against a threat, because in modern armored warfare, you want to keep a thin line with the objective of identifying the enemy's main thrusts. And only then do you vector in your forces to hopefully hit them from the side and the rear. And that was what air-land battle was all about. So I recreated that effect. And when I put all those pieces together, suddenly, Mo, I had swirling tank battles. I had battles where one side was punching into one guy's rear and the other guy was coming around both sides. Who had penetrated into whose rear area? It's almost a question sometimes of which man blinks first. And so what you can expect that will be different in this new game is a lot more realism, more of a brain burner, because modern armored warfare is tough. It's a very violent game. I oriented it towards the offense, but it's mobile. What you should expect is swirling tank battles, and that quick passage of samurai swords, and only one man is standing. So in the original game, every turn was 2 days, and the game played out for the first month, the first 28 days. I upped the pace of combat, so every turn is now a day. And I will tell you, very often in this game, one side or the other is out of an army by turn 8.
Yeah.
But it's not clear which side. And so it's a lot of fun, and it reflects a lot of what we saw in 1973. I really am a student of the Yom Kippur War. There was a division, the 162nd Armored, that the Israelis committed to battle the morning of I think it was the 3rd day, might have been the 2nd day of fighting. It went in, and by nightfall, it lost 248 tanks.
Oh, yeah.
Divisions used to last a little longer than that, right? But in modern warfare, they don't.
Well, that's the thing, it's when I was in armor at the time, we were told that the average life expectancy for an armor crew was 4 minutes in combat. So it's very believable too, because things are so, combat is in armored vehicles. It's so devastating and so quick that, like you were talking about here, you have your Zocs lined up. It's a zone of control. It's not a zone of dominance. So if you have 30 miles, you're not going to control all 30 miles. There's going to be holes in that line, and you have to have that for units to slip through, pour through, and force you to pivot your forces that you have in different locations to try to, as you said, vector in on them and deal with them. Otherwise, you have that attrition battle, that trench warfare style, which is not what you'd expect in a modern armored landscape, and we have not seen in the modern armored landscape.
No, we really haven't. I agree with you. In fact, that 4 minutes is a figure that Fred Schwartz also quotes to me. He was a Bradley commander in the Fulda Gap. And his job was actually to block the first blocking position for 5th Corps at Hunfeld. And he said, my half-life, we estimated, was about 4 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, the cab guys would be out there, and they were just basically, for lack of a better term, bullet sponges, because they were going to know where the enemy is by taking the full brunt of the thrust of the Soviet thrust, which would generally be like a recon unit. It may be the main body, but you're going to usually run into a recon unit or a recon and then a follow-on force with it. You're going to get beat up. And the point of cav is to be beat up, to delay things as long as possible to get the main body ready. So that way they can stand to and be ready to battle, move up to their battle positions and deal with the threat with the maximum amount of force possible. And then they'll beat feet and they'll get back and they'll lick their wounds, and then the main battle takes over from there. But now, before we continue on with NATO, you did mention SPI, and I think it would be pretty cool if you shared the story of how you got into SPI, because I thought that was pretty neat.
Okay, this is a hilarious story. I had wanted to be a game designer since my first war game. And so I saw an ad that SPI put out saying, hey, if you want to be a war game designer, redesign one of these 5 games and send us your submission. And so I worked on it for about 3 months, dutifully packaged up my redesign of Avalon Hill's Russian campaign, carefully put it in a brown manila envelope, and addressed it and stamped it and sent it off to SBI. I didn't hear anything back. Years passed. I'm graduated from college. I'm working at an investment bank in New York, and I knew that SBI had Friday night playtesting. So I wandered in for a playtest session, and I was wearing a 3-piece suit. That turns out to be highly significant for reasons that are most amusing. But I'm playing with Joe Reiser. We're playtesting his Jackson at the Crossroads game. And I get up to go to the bathroom, and I walk out into the hall, and I see a heavy-set gentleman whose name I later discovered was Dave Ritchie. He was the head of development there. And I asked him for directions to the bathroom. And he said, oh, just go down this corridor and take a left, and you'll see it on your first right. And so I didn't think anything of it, and I did my business and came back and sat down with Joe, and he said, they're going to offer you a job. And I said, what? I've talked to anybody here except that guy out there in the hall, and I asked him for directions to the bathroom. Sure enough, up comes Dave Ritchie, and he offers me a job. And because I always wanted to be a war gamer, I took the job right there and then, quit my banking job, came down to SBI, and about 6 months later, I'm rifling through the files, and I discover this manila envelope that looks really quite familiar. And I pull it out and look at it, and yep, it's my redesign of the Russian campaign submission in its original unopened manila envelope. And so there you are. Just next time, if you want to be a war game designer, ask the right guy for directions to the bathroom in a 3-piece suit, and it'll work every time.
Now I want to see how many wannabe game designers, wannabe war game designers are going to go to conventions or go to playtesting sessions or whatever in a 3-piece suit. Maybe you're going to start a new ththing here, because 3-piece suits are not really in right now, but especially now with everybody working from home.
Years.
Yeah.
But yes.
That's a great story. I mean, I remember when we were talking and you told me that story, that was a good laugh. That really was, because how often do you have something so mundane turn into something so life-changing as it was for you as you moved into being a war game designer? Now, when you went in full-time, talk about that journey and how that worked for you and what your thoughts were about game design from that point.
Well, it was kind of rough. SBI was already dying at this point. It went bust about a year later. Jim Dunnigan had just been fired by the board weeks before I came on board, and you could feel a palpable sense of relief in the organization. The kindest thing I can say is that he was probably one of those managers who had management secrets of Attila the Hun on his bedside table. And so the organization was kind of trying to find its way in a new, kinder, gentler world. The new CEO was a fellow by the name of Chris Walker, a businessman that the investors had brought in. And because I was the only person who had any understanding of business, I had an economics minor, he and I used to go out to lunch, and he would describe the economics of producing these games, and that we were shipping our games out to our customers below our own unit cost. And nobody in the organization had really been tracking that or paying attention to the finances. So we were a great design shop, not a great business. And so we went bust about a year later. I was never a designer at SBI. I was a developer. And what I learned from that 1 year there was how important it was to have a check and a balance. The designer's got to be the creative impulse. He's the one who does the heavy lifting. The developer has to make sure that the game actually works, and that the scenarios and victory conditions are balanced, and that the playtesters are, wait for it, actually having fun. And SBI had learned the hard way that if you didn't have a good developer, your game would often be a pretty half-assed entry. So the developer was there to make sure that the end result actually wasn't just thrown over the transom, but had been tested. It was quality control. So I left with a very strong appreciation for that. Today, I don't have developers. I wish I did, but I rely heavily on my playtesters. So, I mean, take NATO. I went and recruited 45 playtesters from Board Game Geeks, people who had said that they liked the original game. And of course, I knew I wasn't going to completely change the original game, so they were probably going to hate it, but that would make them my toughest critics. And so I've carried that lesson of the importance of feedback ever since. And I would say that in today's world, there are so many opportunities to test your design, to crowdsource feedback, crowdsource game ideas. And I have learned to really listen to my playtesters and to their suggestions. I have implemented dozens of suggestions from playtesters that I personally disagreed with, but I would test them against my other playtesters, and they'd all say, Bruce, we think that's a good idea. All right, we're going to do it, right? Because I'm just one of the contributing minds at work, and today that produces a much better game. Obviously, I have to worry about consistency. I'm not going to accept a suggestion that contradicts some basic premise of the game. But with that proviso, I'm listening to see what people really think about how to improve the game. And generally, their ideas are good.
Yeah, and there were a lot of changes that were done in this game. And, you know, you already talked about some of them. Talk about the things that you're excited most about this new design compared to the original design.
Okay.
I know that's
the original design felt like World War I. The new design feels like World War III. It is so mobile. It is so deadly, and I love that. It's a stand-up fight where either player can win, and I think one of the other things I love about it is in a conventional war game, you roll your forces up to that hex, you run the math in your head. There's a 3-to-1 attack. Roll the die. You're done. That's not how NATO is built. It's an operational game for sure, but the battle cycle that you fight every time you attack a hex is its own little tactical subsequence, and it's so much fun. So, I mean, the first thing is there's a strike phase, and so you're trying to use your air power, your artillery, in some cases chemical gas, to disrupt the hex that you're about to attack. And then there is a defensive strike phase, if you're lucky enough to be NATO, who has the flexibility to do that. And so they're going to try and disrupt some of the attacking units. And then there's the reaction phase, but I can pin reaction if I'm the Soviets. I can say, okay, you're going to try and react out of this hex. Well, I'm going to attack it first and pin all of those guys. I might, you know, lose a half a division doing it, but my real target doesn't get reinforced. So there's kind of a cat and mouse game that you play with your limited resources. And so you can roll your forces up and think, okay, I've got a decent 5-to-1 attack here, but you don't really know what's going to happen, not because of a ton of luck, but because of the allocation decisions your opponent might or might not make. And so each player is kind of trying to outguess the other one as to where his main effort is going to fall. And so it produces a lot of tactical nuance, and I like that. You know, you're on the edge of your seat the whole time. The movement system is an I go, you go, and I experimented with pulsing fronts and core, but it's such a mobile game that if you don't advance somewhat linearly, you're going to get badly outflanked, and you're going to get badly outflanked by the game system anyway. In the sense that the ZOCs are so porous. And so let's just say that there's a lot of tension in the game and a lot of excitement. And as I said, it's often over in just 8 turns. One side or the other is smash the other to pieces. So I like that aspect.
And there's also the lead up too, correct?
Well, yes, there was a scenario called the War of Nerves. So let's talk about the scenarios. In fact, can I put up some graphics?
Sure, absolutely. Okay. That's what I was wondering when you wanted to start adding those in.
So let's see. I want to bring up. All right, so we will share my screen. And let's go take a look at.
So Lance just joined in. He says he wants to be sitting at the bar behind me. So there's plenty of room back there, Lance. You're more than welcome. Drinks are on the house.
There we go.
And John wanted to ask if the bank made you beg to come back a year later.
Oh, that was a very strange story. When I finally left the bank, I went to off to school to get a master's, but I was going to take the summer off and just goof off, and they tripled my salary to keep me for the last month because I had so many projects open. It certainly left me feeling that I was really, really underpaid. But all right, so here is the basic map. So I'm going to share this, and tell me when you see that.
There you go. You should see it up on the screen. Everybody should see that right now.
Okay, very good. So that is the NATO map sort of de novo without any units on it. And it essentially goes from the Swiss border up to the tip of Denmark, and it goes from the the western border of Poland up to the eastern France. And so a fairly conventional NATO theater, but with really rich analysis of the terrain. And the game system uses terrain a lot. Terrain impacts a unit's defense values. It can impact its attack values. It can impact whether it has to retreat from a given result or not. And it can impact your defense against airstrikes. And so there's really a rich interaction between units and terrain, which I enjoy. You can see the North German plain up there on the top. And of course, that's the great tank country that the Soviets would have wanted to exploit. The game is set up so that there are 3 scenarios. And let me bring up the first one, which is a strategic surprise scenario. So I'm going to stop screen share, and then I start again, and we'll pick out the next one. Okay.
Real comedy, or comedian there, Brant, saying, see what? We all saw it.
Okay, here we go. So that's the strategic surprise scenario.
Okay.
And this is taking a look at the setup here. Right at the opening of the game, everybody is in barracks positions. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here and make this easier for our audience to see. Okay. But as you can see, this is a situation in which both sides' units are highly scattered in their barracks positions. And in the strategic surprise scenario, which is the first major scenario, the Soviets get a 48-hour jump on us, and they move up to the border, and then NATO rolls for each national army to see how far out of their barracks positions they get before the balloon goes up. So the game is different every time based on those rolls. There's a victory condition balancing mechanism if you roll a whole bunch of ones, but it creates a really interesting surprise scenario in which you really feel surprised because you're desperately trying to get your troops up to the front to form a line. And there are special rules about ammunition. In this era, the Germans were suffering a rash of terrorism. And so there were gangs like the Baader-Meinhof gang and the Red Army faction that were running around. And so U.S. munitions were largely kept in depots under lock and key behind concertina wire. There were local dispersal areas where NATO troops would go to pull out their basic load, and then they'd run for the front. But the supply trucks that had everything they needed once they'd shot off their first basic load, those would have been hard to come by in that first day. And so there is also this kind of panic running out of supply that I model here. So that's strategic surprise. Then the second one is extended buildup, which looks at the exact reverse. Now let's see if I stop sharing, and now I will pick another screen.
And the extended buildup one, this is the one we were, I think, had the most talk about. This is where you kind of, it's almost like a push your luck mechanism where you're trying to get troops to the front and without triggering the entire.
Now we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
Okay.
But this one is. I'm going to show you the extended buildup scenario, and we will also zoom in here. This is not the boil the frog scenario that you're talking about. This scenario is taking a look at what happens when the Soviet Union mobilizes everything. So at this point, they have mobilized every single Category 3 division in Eastern Europe, all the way up to their Western military districts. And this was what the US Army was most afraid of. And it produced a force correlation that was very heavily in the Soviets' favor. So we're now 60 days in. The Soviets have gotten everything up to the front. The NATO National Guards units coming out of the US are beginning to pour into the ports. And as you can see, this is a very, very dense scenario. The Soviets are stacked two divisions per hex. But you give NATO 60 days to dig in, and you'd better expect that you are looking at a highly fortified border. Just a couple of statistics. The West Germans boasted a mine stockpile of 4 million mines. The US boasted a mine stockpile of 19 million mines. Then you had the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Danes. They all had their own mine stockpiles, and the British. So if you just used the US and West German mine stockpile alone, that's enough for 10 mines a meter along the entire Iron Curtain border. 10 mines a meter, right? That's a lot of mines. And that's not counting all those other NATO nations. So there is this conventional wisdom that the greatest counter that NATO would have had to Warsaw Pact air power, to Warsaw Pact tank power, would have been NATO's air power. Mm-hmm. But I would argue that it is the lowly mine that would have been the Soviet tankers' nemesis, because they were cheap, they were effective, and NATO had an awful lot of them.
And that goes to John Longshore's comment before. He said, I also believe that the U.S. Air Force at the time would have demolished the Soviet Air Force in hours, which goes to what you were saying about the air dominance for the NATO forces. They would have had that air dominance possibly, but on the ground, it doesn't matter. You need those tank traps. You need those mines that are going to take out all the armored vehicles. And if you can lay out a spread of mines and obstacles that dense, it's going to be very difficult for anything to really penetrate. Even using the Soviet doctrine of the wave attacks, where they send those T-54s first through, then the 62, 64, 72s after that, they used a better tech later on. It would still be just a massive, giant bunch of wrecks, and mines would be everywhere. And unfortunately, if there was a war, not just the catastrophic losses during the conflict itself, but afterwards, how many decades would it take to remove all those mines physically from that location?
Many. And I mean, there are still reports of mines going off in the Reworking forest from World War II. So yeah, and there are still unaccounted for mines along the former East German border, where the East Germans laid 1.3 million mines, and the West Germans went in and removed them all, or at least as many as they could get. But it was problematic. I do believe that NATO's Air Force, bar an incredible failure of intelligence, would have been able to quickly establish air superiority over its own theater of operations, and probably would have been a pretty sizable threat to the Warsaw Pact in the Warsaw Pact's area of operations. Have I told you the story of Operation Mole Cricket 19?
I don't believe so, but before you do, I just wanted to have the comment up on the screen here from Fabrizio Vianello. He says NATO has been one of his favorite games ever. He played it to death in the 80s, and I'm not sure if you're aware, but Fabrizio is the designer of Under an Iron Sky, as well as Deadly Northern Lights, and then the Oil War, which is going to be the third in his big Third World War series.
Well, please give him my compliments. I've heard wonderful things about Under an Iron Sky. So he clearly knows this era well, and I look forward to playing his game.
Okay, so continue on with your story now.
Well, so Operation Mole Cricket 19, and it bears on this question of the air war and who might have won it. So during the Israeli-Lebanon intervention, which was a war by any other name, the Israelis went up the coastal plain and ultimately besieged Beirut, and they were trying to knock out the Palestinians at the time. The Syrians objected to this and moved an armored division into the Bekaa Valley, which was one valley over from the coastal valley where the Israelis were. And the Israelis saw the threat immediately. The Syrians, who were no slouches, covered that armored division by moving 29 SAM-6 batteries from the Damascus area into the Bekaa Valley to provide essentially an air defense umbrella to their armored division. And at that point, the Israelis unleashed at 2 in the afternoon an air operation called Operation Mole Cricket 19. And you can look that up. It's a great story. But essentially, within the next 2 hours, they took out 19 of those 29 SAM batteries. And the Syrians took sharp objection to the destruction of that much of their really sophisticated hardware. And they were aware, of course, that the Israelis were stripping the umbrella so they could get to the armored division. So the Syrians launched some aircraft. In fact, they launched their entire air force. So that the operation began at 2. At 4, this titanic air battle started. And the operation concluded 2 hours after that. 85 Syrian jets shot down. For the Israelis admitted to the damaging of 2 jets. Who knows what actually happened, but by all accounts, it was an incredibly lopsided victory. At which point the Israelis contacted Assad and said, look, we really aren't looking for a war with you. We have made our point. Pull your armored division back. And Assad, who was looking at an armored division that now had no air cover and no air defenses, did precisely that. And that Syrian armored division got the heck out of Dodge. But that incident sent shockwaves through the Soviet command. Because they were afraid of NATO's air. You know, they'd had observers and serving officers in Vietnam. They'd had a taste of what U.S. air power looked like. But when they looked at the Israelis doing that and thought, okay, that's the Israelis, the U.S. would be, I mean, they have far more aircraft. That sent a shiver up their spines. The CIA ultimately learned that as a result of Operation Mole Cricket 19, the Soviets radically changed their air strategy. Up to that point, it had been a first strike on NATO airfields. After Mole Cricket 19, they concluded that between the American AWACS, the fact that we were building concrete shelters for all of our aircraft, and they didn't have the precision-guided weapons to defeat those without a direct hit, and the results of Operation Mole Cricket 19, they gave up on the idea of a first strike. Their air strategy changed to hunkering down in interceptor mode for the first 6 or 7 days. Maximum sorties, minimum flight time, sheltering behind their SAM belt, but with the idea of keeping it alive by intercepting anything that tried to come at them. And the idea was to wear NATO down for that 6 to 7 days, and then do a counter-air campaign after they had attrited NATO enough that their superiority in numbers could tell. Given what we did to the Iraqi Air Force, and what we likely would have done to the Russian Air Force, I suspect that that wouldn't have worked. I suspect we would have dismantled their Air Force too. And they knew it, or they wouldn't have adopted that. But that was the best that they could come up with. And
yeah, I mean, it's a functional plan when you think about it, because it's like, okay, I know I'm not going to go toe to toe with you. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hang behind my missile shield. And if you try to, launch offensive attacks, our missiles will get you, our aircraft will get you, or will get you, as we will support the ground forces in that regard. So you're going to try to just whittle them down a little at a time. And then hopefully over 5, 6, 7 days, you've treated them enough to where, okay, now we can go on the offense. It makes sense when you think of it in that regard. But NATO air power was so devastating that they probably wouldn't have been as successful as they thought.
Likely we would have punched holes through their SAM belt, and likely we would have gone after their airfields, and likely we would have made their lives miserable. The Soviets were well equipped to operate from dispersed airfields, and so they would have gone guerrilla. They would have put their regiments in little penny packets and, rural airstrips and literally highways, they would have been hard to get to like that, but their sortie rate would have fallen, once they left their central depots, those sortie rates wouldn't have been great. And the Soviet planes needed a lot of maintenance. Ours did too. Our vulnerability would have been gas. I mean, the classic Soviet tactic is that you would lob a couple of Scuds. They don't have to be terribly accurate, but they're dumping several tons of sarin near your airfield. And a pilot in a mop suit is just another piece of furniture in the ready room. There's no way he's flying a jet. He would die of heat prostration.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it. In today's world, I've talked about this with a few people. People are complaining about wearing masks in a COVID world. It's like, try Mop 4 for a few hours.
Try Mop 4, but like in a closed cockpit.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable. But Fabrizio has a great question here. He says he's curious about your opinion on the possibility of a Warsaw Pact surprise attack, taking NATO completely or partially unprepared. They keep having heated discussions on that. And I think that is one of those things. There'll be heated discussions on that for decades.
Yeah, I'll give you my opinion. I think that the analysts were right. I think we had the Soviets under a microscope. I don't think there is any way that they could have prepared for an attack, short of literally coming out of barracks, which wouldn't have worked. Even they knew that. Estimates I've seen say 4 to 7 days of preparation, probably closer to 7, before their armies really would have been ready to roll. I think the bigger question is NATO's political willingness. So to use a real life example, the Israelis knew that the Syrians and the Egyptians were coming in 73, but they were terrified of being seen as executing a first strike as they had in 67, because although that had worked out militarily, it had severely isolated them on the world stage, and they'd lost the support of Britain and France if they ever had it. And as it turned out, Kissinger point blank told Golda Meir, no matter what, you have to absorb the first strike. I cannot help you if you attack first. So they just had to sit there and take it, and they were able to, but they had their own political imperatives to make sure that the US would support them. And as long as there was a surprise attack, so far so good. The analog, Fabrizio, for NATO would be, sure, the analysts would be all screaming, they're coming, they're coming. Sakir may have been screaming, they're coming, they're coming. But ultimately, NATO's top forum, which would have been the defense ministers of each of the individual countries, they had to all agree, we're going to mobilize, we're going to meet the threat. And I can well imagine, the Belgians and the Dutch going, hey, time out, guys. Let's try diplomatic means first, right? And the clock ticks on and ticks on. And, and the other members of NATO, most particularly the West Germans, would be going batshit at that point. So in my own version of NATO, that's exactly what happens. Ultimately, Fabrizio, I say that the West Germans just mobilize. They get so desperate at NATO inaction that they go for it, and that becomes the trigger, the pretext that Sakir uses to order everybody else to mobilize, with approval from his own US president, but not with approval from NATO's ministers. And in effect, he uses the West German mobilization as an excuse to act, possibly illegally within NATO framework, but he does take that final action that gets NATO rolling. But I'm positing that surprise largely as a result of a political unwillingness to act when the intelligence networks are all screaming.
Yeah, and then, like you said, West Germany would be forced to act, and it's their backyard. They're definitely going to do something, and that would be the flashpoint that would set everything off. But
I don't think that the Soviets could have pulled off a real surprise. And Fabrizio, I would welcome your opinion, but my own simulation says that if NATO is actually given a couple of days warning and gets everything up to the border, the Soviets are going to get chewed up really badly if they attack. They only had the choice of the edges of the bell-shaped curve. By the 80s, they either had to really achieve at least tactical surprise in the sense that NATO wasn't reacting, or they had to bring everything and get the force ratio that they ultimately had with full mobilization. Anything in between, and they've only got a relatively small number of divisions. And that's interesting, because I hadn't realized just how many of the Soviet divisions were Category 3. We were always told that NATO would be reaching for the nuclear button on day 3, but that was a myth. The Army quite reasonably wanted to get the maximum funding out of Congress, and so they were talking about this 3-to-1 outnumbering that occurred when all the Soviet divisions came up against our unreinforced, frontline units in NATO. But that was not a fair scenario, if you will. One, because it would have taken them at least 60 days to get those Category 3 divisions ready. When we did Operation Storm, we mobilized 5 National Guard brigades. Only one of them ever made it over there. That was 6 months, right? So the Soviets, they could have probably done better than that, but it would have been an armed mob going over there. So I just don't see the Soviets attacking with anything less than a terrific opportunity for surprise, or kind of bringing everybody to the Tea Party, which brings me to the third scenario you were asking about. So that one is a boiling the frog scenario. There's this story that if you put a frog in a cold water and just heat it slowly enough, it never leaps out. But that is an effort by the Soviets. The scenario is set, assuming that the Soviets are taking decisions to gradually get more and more ready and hoping NATO doesn't notice. And so every time the Warsaw Pact takes another action to get ready, they raise the probability that NATO's alert level will go up. And so it's a game of chicken. NATO's hoping that the die rolls work in his favor, and he ends up being more ready than the Soviets. And the Soviets are hoping that they get lucky, NATO doesn't notice in time, and they can come in. That's another scenario where anything can happen. And it produces a wider range of outcomes than the classic strategic surprise that I've got in there. And then the fourth scenario is just the invasion of Denmark. It's a clever, tight little scenario. I really like it. It's fun. It's not a throwaway scenario. You'll probably find yourself coming back to play it again. But it can be played in about an hour, and it introduces all the game mechanics and kind of gets you into the game quickly.
And Brand makes a comment. He says they're given a 90-day window to be ready to deploy, 48-hour to hit that day on day 82 or so. 256 and 155th took longer, but the arty brigades and the engineering brigades from the National Guard all left well under their 90 days.
Interesting. I've heard a different story. He's right that the artillery brigades were ironically the first to get there. But the story I heard is that only one artillery brigade ever made it in theater. One of them made it to the port, but was so late that they turned it around at the port.
Yeah, and there's John going off to the point that you had earlier was at the time we seemed to be more afraid of massive chemical and biological weapon usage rather than nuclear, which was definitely the case. I think everybody who's been in the military knows NBC training generally was all about biochem. It was, nuclear was like find a lowest spot possible and hold on, because you're either going to die or you're not. It's one of those two things. Whereas chemical and bio, there's a way to combat those, and you can hit things and they can stay in low-lying areas. You can still move your forces through after you've killed the enemy. So they were much more effective, and they were some that were short-term use weapons that you can go in there and, okay, it's going to kill everything, and then it'll move out of here in X amount of hours. So you can then move in and take that area. So those were definitely a much more viable and are a much more viable weapon to use in that instance to take out the most or inflict the most casualties possible.
I will admit I have a slightly different perspective on chemical warfare, and I have studied it. I would argue that its value is as much psychological as physical. If you look at the casualty rates, it's actually remarkably hard to kill people. I mean, even the sarin gas release in the subway did far less damage than those Japanese terrorists believed that it would. It just disperses so quickly. What I do believe the Soviets would have done is use chemical weapons to protect their flanks. They would have plastered their flanks with persistent nuclear weapons and dared NATO troops to come through. But if you're actually hitting the area that you are trying to move through, your tanks are going to be all buttoned up. Your people are going to be very cautious. And frankly, as the attacker, you are more vulnerable when you're buttoned up than the defender, who knows exactly where he is and is sitting in his field of fire waiting for something to appear in it to shoot. So I don't think that the Soviets would have used chemical weapons kind of as a frontline weapon. I believe they would have used it strategically to protect flanks, to plaster ports, to make our airfields unusable. There would have been great uses of chemical weapons, but they wouldn't have used them like artillery.
No, it wouldn't have been used to that extent. But like you said, it would have been a great psychological weapon as well. And it also is a physical weapon because you would decrease somewhat, which is why you train in MOP gear. It would decrease the effectiveness of units by having them in that MOP level. You need to be in MOP 2 at least, and then hang in there, maybe 3 or 4 once you get
But remember, your own guys have to be in MOP 2.
Yes.
I mean,
you'd be in MOP 2 for extended periods of time.
You can use non-persistent agents.
Yeah.
The challenge is those non-persistent agents can drift in a lot of different directions, as we've seen, including towards your own troops. So, you may have said to your troops, well, no, you guys don't get to use MOP suits. Boy, would they have been keen to attack through that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about nuclear weapons if we can.
Sure.
I really didn't want to put nuclear weapons into the original game, and I didn't want to put nuclear weapons into this game. And in fact, I began with a version of this game that said, if you want to use nuclear weapons, here is my optional rule. Soak the map in lighter fluid and apply a match. But my playtesters had a very different perception. They said, Bruce, the threat of nuclear war was very real. People, you as commanders, you had to be aware that you had the sword of Damocles hanging over you, and so we want real nuclear weapons. So I thought about that, and I came up with this mechanic, which I really like. You can use a nuclear weapon, and you will pretty much wipe out anything in the 1 hex that you use that weapon in. But after you've used that weapon, you roll the die. And on a 1, you have triggered a strategic nuclear exchange, and you lose the war decisively. As much a penalty for triggering everybody losing, but you're the one who did it. You can then throw a second nuke, but now it's going to be a 1 or a 2, and you'll end the world. So you can follow the math, but you can throw as many as 5 nukes. Your 6th one will end the world. The other guy gets tit for tat. So if you throw 1, I can throw 1 and I don't have to roll. But if I throw 2, if I up the ante, then I have to roll again. And so it produces this kind of tension of who's going to escalate? Am I desperate enough to escalate? So by and large, players do not use nuclear weapons in the game, but I've been fascinated by this mechanic because there are decisive victory rules in here. If the Warsaw Pact crosses the Rhine, they win decisively. If NATO takes 3 cities in East Germany or Czechoslovakia, well, the war isn't going very well. We're losing cities instead of taking cities, and you lose the war decisively. So what happens is when the Soviets cross the Rhine, which is more often than not what triggers this, NATO says, well, I'm going to lose the game decisively anyway. Nuke the bridgehead. And I've had some fabulous games, where it all came down to the final nukes that incinerated the bridgehead or didn't. But the nuclear rules really do add a kind of a nice little tension without getting out of hand. Once you've triggered Armageddon, we're not executing, kind of, well, tactically what happens after that? There isn't anything that happens after that. It's all gone. There was a CIA study, top secret, but now declassified, that analyzed what would happen in a Soviet first use scenario using no ICBMs. And they estimated that there would be 1,000 warheads detonated within 200 miles of the FIBA and 2,000 warheads detonated deeper in theater in the first day. 3 1,000 nuclear warheads in Northern Europe, there wouldn't have been very much left to fight over.
No, no. At that point, you'd be using sticks and stones. And Brant has a question here. He says, for Bruce, on the NATO side, does it matter which NATO country launches the nukes?
No, it doesn't. The mechanic of losing, with a 1/6 chance for every nuke that you use, essentially assumes that nuclear weapons could have been used everywhere. They were, with the exception of the French, nuclear weapons were under US lock and key, but with our allies able to fire the missiles or artillery shells. So the assumption is that we will put the release of that nuclear warhead wherever we're desperate, wherever the bridgehead is, or wherever there's a major breakthrough, somewhere it has to be. I'm sorry. Pardon me, I'm going to get some water because I'm clearly...
Sure, absolutely. So any questions you guys have while Bruce steps away to get a drink of water, make sure to put them in the comments, and that way we can ask him as he, while we get him in between telling these excellent tales about the different scenarios and the different pieces of research he's had. So make sure you get your questions in the chat. And OG says, mop gear sucks. Yes, it does. It definitely does.
Yeah, and that question about which country, the French were the independent nuclear power. And one of my playtesters who I've actually given development credit to because he was so helpful is Fred Schwartz. And he spent a year at the French Command College. And he said the French were all absolutely adamant that if the Soviets ever crossed the Rhine, they were going to nuke them. Mm-hmm. And so they probably would have been the first movers if that was the part of the Rhine that had been breached.
Now, did you have any more images that you wanted to share?
Well, yeah, I can kind of show a little bit of the game in progress and give some idea of the loss ratios. So let's. I'm going to share a strategic surprise game in play. Let's see, game turn. Okay, I may not have those up. Here we go.
And Brant was also adding in a comment about chemical weapons. Soviet doctrine had expected use of non-persistent chemical weapons to isolate battalions, brigades, to force them to react to being slimed while they attacked the units that were not under chem and circle back later, which is pretty much what we were talking about before, about how it would be psychological as well as casualty-wise, but it would be really more for a strategic advantage and forcing units to react certain ways and to do different things, so that way you can hopefully advance into that area.
Okay, so I need to share my screen again.
Mm-hmm.
Aha, okay. There we go. Okay. For some reason, it was showing
production issues.
Well, it was telling me that my screen was blocked. Here we go. All right. Can you see that?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. This is turn 13. So one turn before the end of the game. And we are looking at the strategic surprise scenario. And you have these purple units in the center of the screen, which are the Polish front moving forward. But as you can see, there is virtually nothing left of either side. There's just a few British and US units clinging to the Rhine and just a few Soviet units left trying to get over it, but they have fought themselves literally to oblivion. The US is holding the center. These little units here are East German border guards holding the Thurungerwald, and the Czech front has been contained, but I mean, there's virtually no U.S. units left there. The French army is doing the containing. So just massive destruction in this one. And that is classic. But in this case, the Poles are still coming forward. There's still one more front that's about to slam into NATO. And so were this particular scenario to continue, it does look like the Poles would get across the Rhine. And NATO probably would have lost this one. So
unless they were able to nuke the bridges.
Unless they nuked the bridges, but that's enough Polish units that you would probably trigger Armageddon if you drop that many nukes. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stop sharing. So what I'm going to do is now open up the extended buildup, the second one that we saw, and I will share my screen. But this looks at what's going on with a situation which both sides have pretty much brought everything they have. And so now we're looking at turn 9. So if I share my screen, okay, so here we go. All right, so I will zoom in here. Okay, so we see that the Soviets around Hanover have finally broken through NATO's fortified line. This is now day 9 of 14 days, and NATO has fallen back to the Weser. But NATO has pretty much held, within 15 miles of the front. So it took the Soviets 9 days of smashing at that NATO line to eventually wear NATO down enough to get a breakthrough. Now, that's in the north, where NATO is pretty tough. In the south, the Soviets got a clean breakthrough early, and they are streaming through Bavaria, heading towards France, with the French desperately trying to hold them on the German side of the Rhine. So here, the Soviets do have a pretty good breakthrough in the south, and they probably would have won this one as well. These are two representative games, but in both cases, the games are really quite balanced. It's not a foregone conclusion that either side is going to win these scenarios. So
yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask you to touch on. It was the balance as far as the chance for NATO to defend successfully and win, and the chances for the Warsaw Pact to successfully accomplish their goals and win the game.
Both scenarios are really, I would say, remarkably balanced, but the game system rewards an aggressive player. And so generally, when I have watched playtest sessions, the aggressive player wins. This is not a game where NATO can sit back and expect that the CRT is going to attrite the Soviets and he will ultimately come out, having stopped them and by wearing them down. If NATO wants to wear the Warsaw Pact down, they have to counterattack relentlessly. This is a game that really rewards an offensive spirit. Mm-hmm. And so this is a game where both sides are taking great white shark bites out of each other, and it's sort of last man standing, which is really fun. So fairly balanced. I will say that the war of nerves scenario, if the Soviets are lucky and get to really boil the frog, that one can be pretty desperate for NATO. Mm-hmm. That's certainly a scenario that has a much wider range of outcomes. But it can work the other way. The Soviets can be unlucky and they can be trying to, get a jump on NATO, and NATO ends up being more prepared than the Soviets ever wanted them to be, because their agencies are reacting. So you take your chances. And there are a lot of different strategies that the Soviets can follow for when they're boiling the frog. Are they going to concentrate on getting their air forces up and ready? Are they going to concentrate on getting their ground forces up and ready? Are they going to concentrate on throwing maneuvers as an excuse to get lots of units up to the border, even though they're not particularly ready with anything behind them? So the Soviet player has all these tools, but he can't do all of it, or NATO will absolutely be ready for him. So he's got to pick and choose his strategy.
Well, a couple of things while you've got the map up, I wanted you to.
Sorry.
No, that's right. I wanted you to cover is one was supply, obviously, because that's handled a little unique in a unique manner, and then also the air forces themselves, as far as the projection of air power and
Yes,
how that can move, and how you want to make sure you don't overextend yourself and you have to make sure that you maintain your lines with your air power.
Okay, no, those are great questions, and they're highly interrelated. I wrote a computer program for each scenario that modeled the rise and fall of air operations as the Soviets brought reinforcements forward, as the US was bringing their Air Force over from the States, and there is a natural ebb and flow. We know from 73 that sortie rates dropped off pretty fast. I mean, you could get 2 or 3 sorties in the first day, but you wore your pilots out, and that was extremely stressful flying. Ask anybody who flew in Vietnam, and that isn't anything like the high intensity environment this one would have been.
Yeah.
So the both sides deploy 2 kinds of air points. There are tactical air points that work within 5 hexes of the front line, and then there are operational air points representing F-111s and Su-24s and Tornadoes that have the ability to strike anywhere on the map. Your tactical air points are certainly more plentiful, but your operational are far more valuable. And in particular, NATO can use his operational air points to bomb the Soviet rail net. There are only 4 rail lines that ran east-west that would have reinforced this front. And of course, the NATO Air Force knew where those rail lines were. So the Soviets don't worry about supply for the first week. They have enough supply in theater. But for their second week of operation, they've got to bring forward supply points, and every supply point allows you to activate a front. NATO can use their operational air points to hammer those supply points coming in and hamstring the Soviets in the second week, if NATO still has an army to hamstring them in the second week, because you weren't using your operational air points to stop Soviet spearheads. So there's a very interesting trade-off mechanic in whether you play for now or play for later. But air is absolutely critical, because if you successfully use your air at the point of decision, you disrupt those targets, your attack produces far higher odds. So you want to use your air power to soften up that hex that you're about to attack. So we don't play an air war. You just are using the air points that represent the bombing missions that get through. So effectively, each player is told, you've got so many missions that are going to get through. Where are you putting your main effort so that the ones that do get through where you want them? I did have an entire air game, but the challenge is the original NATO was playable in a single sitting, and I really wanted this game to be playable in a single sitting. Throw in an air game and it simply isn't. So I went back to the original concept of points, but the different uses for air in this game are really quite rich. You can use air to strike enemy units. You can use air to interfere with supply. You can use air to interdict. And the original game had some interdiction, but I made interdiction a much richer function. And there are times where, for both sides, air interdiction is far and away the best use of your air power to slow down somebody's advance rather than to actually try and destroy them.
And it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, from a strategic or a tactical perspective, you're going to want to try to, as you gather intelligence here, we have God mode, we see everything. But in the real world, you find intelligence that you've got X unit over here, it's moving towards the front. You want to interdict it before it can get there, so that way it can't reinforce the units that you're trying to punch through. So it's a great way of adding that in the game in an abstract manner, but still reflecting the choices that the commanders would have and the decisions they'd have to make on the front line.
Yep. So this brings us to another aspect. I did something with supply that seems bass-ackwards, but it works really well. Traditionally, you check a unit's combat supply just before it attacks. And if it's in combat supply, great, then it's normal. And if it's not in combat supply, it's halved. I did the reverse. You always carry your basic load with you in this game, so you don't check combat supply before you attack, but you do check it after you have attacked. So after you've shot off your basic load, Are you within range of core trains or front trains to resupply?
Mhm.
And it means that if I do get a spearhead that's cut off, it's got one attack in it. And then after that, it's out of supply. It produces a surprisingly realistic feel to the game, and it encourages players to try and get behind their opponents. I also use rules for flank and concentric attack. So if you hit an enemy unit and it's surrounded by ZOCs, but adjacent to at least one friendly unit, then you get a flank attack. If it is surrounded by enemy ZOCs and not adjacent to any other friendly units, then it's subject to a concentric attack. Flank attack is a column shift, concentric is 2 column shifts. This turns out to be really material, and because the game allows you to advance after combat as much as 2 hexes, you can actually use combats to set up adjacent combats by outflanking the target of that next attack. And so there is a battle cycle for individual combats that is pretty rich, but there's also a very real opportunity to set up an operation where you're making multiple attacks with the ultimate objective that that last attack is going to be a killer because of what you did with the setup attacks.
Yeah.
And that produces, the operations in here are really rich, and a war gamer who is paying attention to his operations can really dismantle an opponent who isn't.
Yeah, when we were talking about this, I was really getting more and more excited about what you're talking about there, about the concentric attacks, and you can get the flanking. You're forcing the gamers to think in a bigger dimension than they normally are. It's just you just punch your hole, boom, you're good. In your standard game here, you've got to think, okay, I'm not worried about necessarily this attack succeeding. I'm trying to do this attack here to set up the next one, and you have to understand the stepped advance that happens in operational movement like this, and I think that's really cool. Yeah.
So if we zoom in for just a second, I'll give you an example of this. Okay, at this zoom, the unit quality is pretty awful. So I may have to zoom out just a little bit. Okay, so if this were the Soviet first term, these Soviet units in hex 2917 could actually punch into 2918 and 2818, and they would end up in the rear of this Dutch unit.
Mm-hmm.
If these units came forward, then this Dutch unit here in 2819 would be flanked by the Soviet stack that got into its rear here. But if the Soviets set up an attack in these 2 wooded hexes and knocked out this stack of Dutch brigades in the rear and forced them back, then it would possibly end up with a concentric attack on this Dutch division here. Because you'd punched away its flank support, you'd punched into its rear, it's now surrounded by enemy ZOCs with no adjacent unit, and you've essentially pocketed that force.
Yeah.
So it's a classic example. So this is a very tactical game for an operational game.
Yeah.
And yet it plays quickly.
That's one of the things that I was very impressed with from your description, and now seeing it here, it makes even more sense than it did when we were talking about it. Is even though it's an operational game, it feels that it's going to play like a tactical game, and it's you have to really think ahead. You have to prepare, and you can easily overextend yourself because you were saying how it really benefits or rewards the aggressive player. And I like to be an aggressive player in a situation like this, but I know as an aggressive player, I can get myself in a lot of trouble when I get too aggressive.
Agreed. You can. The game is coming out the first or second week of March. We're still on schedule for that. I am extremely excited about that. I am very much looking forward to interacting with players. I will say this. I put an incredible amount of time into writing the rules, and I did enlist 45 playtesters to test it. So those rules have been read by a lot of people. I had 6 separate editors. Every time somebody offered to edit the rules. I gave them the rules and let them edit it. So it was continuously edited during its development. And so I will warrant that if there are more than 3 sentences of errata, I'm going to go out into the parking lot and shoot myself.
Let's not go that far.
But I really have worked on making sure that this rule set is complete. It covers all the important cases. You're not going to be scratching your head going, what happens here? It's very much set up for reference. So it's got 5 pages of an index, indexing everything at the table of contents level. And it is very organized. And I erred on the side, if there is a rule that you might expect to see in supply, but you might also expect to see it in the ZOC rules, you may find it, you will either find it in both places, or you will find that one of those places references the other with a case reference. So the point is, I hate hunting through a set of rules, looking for something I remember reading, but I can't find it. Yeah. That will not happen with this rule set. You will find what you are looking for easily. And so I really put a lot of work into making sure that the rules were clear, that they were well written, well edited, and they didn't leave room for rules lawyers to debate what happens here or there.
Good.
And so I think players will be very happy when they open up the box. They get a game system that really works. It is fun to play, and they will not be fighting the game system. It has a very complex sequence of play, and players reported at first saying, wow, this is quite a complex sequence of play. Universally, by their third play, they're going like, wow, we're not even looking at the sequence of play chart anymore, because everything happens when you would logically think it would happen. Yeah. So it ends up being second nature. And I had playtesters say that back to me, that they had been daunted by how complex it seemed. But once they actually started playing, they went, wow, okay, so this kind of makes sense. I get what you're doing. It's easy to execute. And I'm not even looking at the sequence of play anymore.
Well, that's the thing. There's a difference between complex and complicated. Complex means there's a lot of layers to think through. Complicated means I got to keep digging into the rules because there's so many rules and sub rules and exceptions. And yeah, then it becomes almost like work. But then we had a comment here, John, saying 40 years later, thinking that, thank God it was make-believe. And that goes into two things, two last things. One first thing I was going to say was, or ask your opinion on, is why are we seeing a resurgence now, do you think, in these Third World War, 1980s games that are coming out now that have become very, very popular?
Honestly, Mo, I can't explain that. I think some of it is the resurgence of Russia and what's going on in the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I think we're, being reminded that the Soviets, or I shouldn't say the Soviets, that the Russians, remain a threat. Although I'm very mindful that during the Trump administration, the rest of the world, in survey after survey, viewed the U.S. as the greatest threat to world peace. But I certainly don't believe that's true. I think the Soviets are a real threat to world peace. But I think that may have some of it. But I can't really explain why this era got so popular.
Well, I think just my own opinion on it, I think, is a lot of us that were in the military and a lot of us that grew up in that era are at wargaming age, and not anything against younger wargamers, but generally the wargamers that are really heavy into war games are in their 40s, 50s, 60s and beyond. And the people that are in that age group right now, this was our era. This was the era that we would have been in the big cataclysm. And I think since we didn't have it, we're like, hey, let's, vicariously play it out on the table in a safe way and see what the what ifs would have been. Plus, we also have the benefit of 2020 hindsight now with more declassified information from the Soviets, whereas before there was a lot of misinformation, like you were saying before, for the U.S. military. To keep those purse strings open, you got to get everybody afraid, constantly afraid of the Soviet threat, and that would mean that you're going to keep getting those big fat budgets. So now we're finding
out the Soviets were doing the exact same thing with us. They, They were
Yeah.
screaming, the Americans are coming, the Americans are coming. Both armies were sort of making the other guy the boogeyman.
Yeah.
But that is human nature. I agree with your audience member. I think younger people really have no idea just how much hardware was parked waiting for Armageddon.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so happy those days are over. The idea that the Russians now have a brigade for every division that they used to have, ditto the Europeans, we're really the only ones who didn't substantially wind down our ground forces. And I think the world is a safer place. Not safe by any stretch, but thank God the Cold War never went hot.
Well, the other thing too is from the Cold War perspective is the world really came down to two sides at that point. There was a little more clarity because you had the two biggest kids on the block with a baseball bat behind their backs. Sometimes they'd get nose to nose with each other, and they'd bring that baseball bat back like they're going to crack the other guy over the head, but it never came to a swing. It was always posturing, thankfully, that it never came to the swing.
Well, and NATO points to some of that, Mo, which is to say, despite what I was weaned on, that we were going to get overrun, I think the Soviets ran the same analysis and said,
sure,
NATO is tough enough that there really isn't any percentage in trying to go after them. And, as Sting famously sang, the Russians love their children too.
Absolutely.
So I think we did successfully deter them. And I think that the effort that we put into collective defense and NATO ended up breaking the Soviets. They just couldn't sustain that economically. Have I ever told you the story of the gas turbines?
No.
This is a great story. It was told by the CIA director after the Berlin Wall fell on a 60 Minutes show. But one day, a General Electric engineer in their turbine division, and this was a division that made turbines that pressurized gas pipelines, told his boss that he had been approached by a gentleman with a deep Slavic accent and an ill-fitting suit who had offered him $100,000 for the blueprints to GE's latest gas pressurization pipeline. The Soviets earned about 1/3 of their foreign currency earnings from selling gas to Western Europe. They were using ancient piston technology to pressurize their pipelines, and they desperately wanted something more modern. So they figured they'd just steal it from the Americans. So the boss contacted legal. Legal was smart enough to contact Langley and say, we think we've got some espionage here. And so the CIA came down and interviewed the engineer, and they carried a booklet with all the pictures of the Soviet embassy personnel. And sure enough, there was Boris, known KGB agent. He was the guy with the offer for $100,000. And so he said, well, okay, so obviously you don't want us to proceed with this. And the CIA said, no, we do want you to proceed with it. Tell your engineer to set up the meet. Meanwhile, they sent a team of 6 guys down, and they interviewed the design team for those turbines. And they said, you guys have spent 40 years taking out every point of failure from this turbine, right? And they said, oh, yeah. So you know where all the points of failure are, right? Oh, yeah, we do. We want you to put them all back in again, but don't make it obvious. And they did. So they sabotaged the blueprint. And then for $100,000, they sold it to the Soviets. And the Soviets built the damn things and put them in all over their pipeline networks. And as luck would have it, the first turbine that failed was the last turbine in their pipeline into Arkhangelsk, their Arctic port.
Yeah.
When it failed, it caught fire. The fire went down the pipeline, took out the refinery. The refinery was 10% of their total refining capacity.
Wow.
Or 1/3 of their foreign exchange earnings. Gone up in smoke. The CIA director said the fire was so big we saw it from space. So there was a lot of things that were going on. It wasn't just the military effort that bankrupted them, right? We were actively sabotaging them, and that's a classic example. Obviously, they still bear us no goodwill for stuff like that. But
Well, when you have a Soviet era KGB guy running your country, that's not going to happen. But
no, and he caveat emptor, right? he was
exactly,
bribing his way into the design. You get what you steal. But
exactly.
it does make you wonder. I mean, we know that the Russians and the Chinese are robbing us blind,
Mhm.
and a lot of blueprints are being stolen from corporate servers. But I have to believe that not all of that is what the Chinese and the Russians think it is.
Yeah. Now, the last thing we wanted to just touch on real quick, because it's not going to be as soon as NATO is, but I wanted you to just give a little thumbnail sketch on Air and Armor, which you also have coming out through Compass Games as well.
So Air and Armor was a game system that I loved, and it is a game system that worked well. My evidence for that is that I got a call about 6 years ago, and a gentleman said, "Is this Bruce Maxwell?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Is this the Bruce Maxwell who designed Air and Armor?" And at that point, I hadn't played the game in 20 years. I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Do you know that there is still a cadre of ex-US Army officers? We meet all over the world, and we play your game to relive our glory days, because we all agree it was the most realistic game of that era." He was at that point working for BMW in Germany, but he said, "I have a club in Chicago. Would you like to meet me? We'll drink whiskey and play Air and Armor." And thus it was. But great fun. But unlike NATO, where I just completely redesigned that, Air and Armor is coming out very similarly as a game system to what it was. I have added a reconnaissance function that works really well. I'm happy with that. I've added an overrun function. You seldom want to use it, but it's a threat against small forces in the open. And I have taken a lot of feedback on improvements to the air game, particularly from the famous designer Lee Brimacombe Woods, who loved Air and Armor, but had his own ideas about what the air game should look like. So when I went to redo this, I just called him up and said, "Lee, what do you got? Let's talk." So I incorporated a lot of his suggestions for improvement. The pieces have been redone. The map is probably the biggest change. I got a message from a gentleman who said, in fact, here, let me bring this up because this is fun. He said, "Will there be a chance to fix the egregious errors on the map?" And since I had built the map from 1 to 50,000, let's see, PNG, this is probably the best way to bring it up. Maps, I mean, I'm using original military maps from the era. How can there be egregious errors? But he was a duck hunter, meaning a air defense officer who served in Würzburg at the time that Air and Armor is set in, and he bought the original game in the PX, which is wild, in Würzburg. He went on to be an avid wargamer, and he is now a professional cartographer. So, when he said is there a chance to fix the egregious errors on the map? Boy, did I want his input. So I called him up, and he gave me just wonderful input on reading the terrain there, far better than I had. So I'm going to share the Air and Armor map here. Okay, so we'll stop that and then reshare, and Air and Armor map here. There it is. All right. Can you see that?
Yep, it's up now.
Okay, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I want to show people some of the things. One thing is I got the road network wrong. A lot of the roads that I thought were highways turned out to be one-lane Bundesstraßen. So one lane in each direction. So really only the Autobahns actually had multiple lanes. So we redid the road map. Another thing was that I allowed the Soviets to cross the main river. And my cartographer said, "Bruce, you weren't crossing that river. You could get a tank into it, but you weren't getting a tank out of it." And he gave me some very compelling reasons for that. But that radically changed the scenarios and has led us to put in much more detailed river crossing rules for ferry and amphibious assault. And then I had misread the change of altitude. And essentially, I had said that there were hills, and he said, Bruce, those aren't hills, those are valleys. And so he gave me a lot of information on the escarpments. And as you can see here, the main has basically created a little canyon that it's running through with escarpments on one side. And so this is a much more accurate map than the original game. I will also share you the pieces, which I think are, I love these pieces. The artist is Bruce Urian, who did the NATO map, and he's done this map. But the job that he did on these pieces, I think, is just outstanding. So let me open that. Here we go. So share screen. Okay. So this is a picture of the U.S. You've got U.S. Air and helicopters on the upper left. You've got the U.S. 3rd Division on the upper right, and then down below the area units, you have the West German 12th Panzer Division. You also have the 26th Luftland Air Mobile Division, and you have the Canadian 4th Mechanized Brigade Group. And then everything has a back side, which I'm scrolling through. Tons of markers for disruption and mines and acquisition. Here are the Soviet units. So you're looking at the units of the 27th Guards Motor Rifle Division and 39th Guards Motor Rifle Division. We scroll down here. You're looking at all the different missions. A lot of the original game used paper and pen, and you would write things down. We now have tracks for everything, player's aids for everything. It is a substantially upgraded game in terms of the player aids, so you're not having to write everything down. It's all run on tracks. I also included an extra division, the 4th East German Motor Rifle Division that you see in gray here on the right, which is great fun. And so we are adding new scenarios, and we are rebalancing the existing scenarios, but the unit values here have all changed based on additional research that I did. And but the heart of the game, the way it plays exactly the way people will remember it from before.
That's fantastic. And, you know, when we were talking about this one, it was the way I put it to you, I think you really liked, was you have a simulation wrapped up in a game, masquerading around as a game is how I put it, because this is more simulation feel than NATO is. NATO is definitely a game. This one has much more of a simulation feel. You have to make a lot more almost like real world decisions, like more so along the lines of what a military commander would have to make than you do in necessarily make in the other games.
Well, what I love about Air and Armor is that you have hidden intelligence. So you know that you've got this tank unit here, but underneath it is one of these step markers. So there might be a dummy underneath that unit. There might be a company. There might be a battalion. At the extreme, there might be an entire regiment there. And so one playtester said to me, Air and Armor is the 3-card Monty of wargaming. And that just had me in stitches. But you win the game as much by deceiving your opponent as to where your main effort is, as you do by any other mechanism. And it is, again, a game that really rewards the aggressive player. So this at a tactical level has such a wonderful feel of modern armored warfare. I mean, if you get it right, you're literally pulling off surprises and ambushes where the other guy was thinking, wow, I thought you had nothing there.
Yeah.
It turns out that was actually your main effort. So this is a game as much of out-thinking or outwitting your opponent as having more forces than him. So it's a really neat game. And I've been playing with a bunch of professional military officers, and they are having a blast, because they're going like, wow, this feels like I can use Soviet doctrine and it works.
Yeah.
So it's fun. I'm very excited to have this game out. But I am play testing the game just so thoroughly to make sure that these scenarios all work and are balanced with the new unit values, the new geography, and the new reconnaissance rules. Because in the original game, the only way you saw what the enemy had was reconnaissance by fire. But that isn't actually quite fair, because there are other means of reconnaissance. So
Sure.
now headquarters have reconnaissance points. So you're playing a shell game with me, but I'm trying to see what's under cup number 2.
Yeah.
Maybe I can, maybe I can't. But and it's carefully balanced. You don't have enough reconnaissance points that you can see more than 1 or 2 things. And this is really fun. I added a counter battery cycle. So, Party A runs their tanks up and they hit the town and they plaster it with artillery. And then Party B says, wait a second, I'm going to roll on the counter battery fire table because I might see some of those guys with my counter battery radars or my sound ranging systems. So I'll fire at some of your artillery. Well, then I opened up. So now your guys are spotting me and you're firing at me. And the cycle continues until one side or the other says, either I'm out of artillery or I'm going to save some of my artillery because I've got other operations I need to support. But there's a very active counter battery exchange in this game, and both sides are always trying to wipe out the other guy's artillery. It's a fun little game, and we set it up so we have a fair number of little scenarios where you're running 1 or 2 brigades around, maybe against a division, and then we have medium-sized scenarios where you might have 1 division against 2 divisions, and then there is one mega scenario where you have essentially 7 NATO brigades taking on 5 Russian divisions, called Hammer and Anvil. That's a heck of a scenario.
Nice.
Everything in the kitchen sink scenario.
I really like the idea of the counter battery, because so often in games, artillery is just strength points or a column shift or whatever. It's just an additional combat factor that's added in, and there's nothing to be, it's free. Essentially, you're taking out of a pool, but there's no there's no recourse for the other side. Here, it's like, well, guess what? I'm going to roll on a table and see if we triangulate. If we do, guess what? Counter batteries coming your way, and now I can try to whittle you down. So you have to make that decision. Do I want to risk taking the counter battery fire by committing this artillery? But you need to commit it anyway. And then when you do you just immediately break down and move, or do you fire back again and then take another round before you break down and move?
It really does make you think about whether you want to open up, particularly with your rockets, because the Soviets have very effective rocket artillery, but between the length of the round and the fins, their radar cross-section was like 100 times greater than an artillery shell, and they were moving relatively slowly compared to an artillery shell. So in this era, everybody had counter battery radars that worked well against mortars and well against rockets. Didn't work very well against shells at all, except very high trajectory howitzer rounds.
Sure.
But the US finally broke the code. They'd tried 2 generations of counter battery radars that had been flops. But in the late 70s, they came out with the Firefinder system, and it was the first radar and the first instantiation of kind of this new generation of American electronics that was fast enough, it had enough processing power to see cannon shells in flight. And so suddenly we could see virtually everything they had out to 15 miles, and we could see rockets out to 30 miles. So the Soviets would have, they had a lot of artillery, and we were quite correctly afraid of Soviet artillery because they had so many battalions.
Sure.
But they might not have had a whole bunch of battalions for a very long time, because if we were assiduous about using that Firefinder radar, and we had 3 of those sets per division, we would have made the life of their artillery batteries hell.
So that's really great. And last question here is, how has the experience been so far working with Compass Games?
They've been incredibly supportive. Every time I have asked for can I get a counter sheet? Could I get a this? Could I get a that? They have given it to me. And it is clear that they have learned lessons from some of the things that didn't work so well early in their history. So when it comes to quality control and checking on things and anytime I've said, look, if I do this, it will materially improve the quality of the game, they've just pretty much said blank check. So I will speak very highly for their efforts to produce a quality game. And that hasn't always been Compass's reputation, but they're learning and listening. And I would tell you as a designer that I have been very happy with the support I've gotten. My only quibble is that I would really love to have a developer. John Kranz is formally their developer, but practically speaking, he's a project manager trying to juggle as many as 10 games at one time. That's an impossible role for one person. So I don't have that check and balance that I would want from a developer. So I've basically appointed my playtesters, my developers, which is why I listen so carefully to their suggestions for improvement. But I've got good things to say about Compass, and I will warrant that when this game comes out, nobody will be complaining about the quality of anything.
Well, don't say nobody, because there's always somebody that's going to complain. You and I both know that.
Well, maybe so, but I think they'll be happy. I put 3 years of my life into NATO. It's as polished as a game can get, and I will warrant that Aaron Armour is going to be equally polished. I don't produce a whole bunch of games, but I will want the people who like playing my games to go, boy, if we buy a Bruce Maxwell design, we won't have that sinking feeling after the first game of, oh boy, okay, I won't be taking this one down again. And particularly with both of these games, Mo, I built them for replayability. The thing I most want is I want to produce designs where people don't just play them once and put them back on the shelf. I want to be producing designs that are so much fun that people will just take them down and play them again and again.
That's fantastic. And, it sounds like you put a lot of effort into these games, and it's going to really pay off for everybody. And Compass has done a great job. And, to what you said, to your point, they did have some issues in the past, and it seems like they've taken it to heart and they've really turned it around. They've just dramatically improved their production process, and the quality has really taken off this year. In 20, I should say, they really became a go-to publisher, and everybody knows GMT is like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I would say right now that Compass is the 400-pound gorilla in the room, and they're laying on the couch right now eating a bag of cheeseburgers. So they're rapidly approaching that 500 and 600-pound on their way to the 800-pound gorilla market as well. So buy with confidence, I think, from them. And it sounds like we can buy with confidence from your work on both of these designs.
Well, I hope so. I really celebrate the democratization of this industry, meaning that there is an opportunity for virtually anybody to submit a game design to one of these independent outfits and get it published, and the market sorts out the winners and losers. But there's some real gems being published, and I think it's wonderful that the industry really is experiencing a renaissance, and that we're getting so much crowdsourcing. I know back in my day, I will say that the design teams at SBI and Victory Games, we were pretty snobbish, right? Our worldview was we were really good and nobody else knew how to do this. That's not true anymore. There's some very talented people out there who are practicing their trade of coming up with good games. And I mean, I saw a design by an Italian game designer by the name of Arrigo Velicogna, who is producing a game called Black Horse, set very similarly in the same era as Aaron Armour, and just following the Black Horse Armored Cavalry Regiment up in Fulda Gap. But it's a very clever little design. And, there's Arrigo in Italy just going, I'm going to create a war game and it's going to be good. And I've read his rules. I think it's really quite well done, and I think people will enjoy it. But it's a classic example of, in my day, nobody would have given a design like that a second look. Today, it's possible for Arrigo to find a publisher and get it published, and the market will determine whether it was a great game or not. But he has a chance. And I think that's wonderful.
It is. I agree with you 100%. So we can look forward to NATO, The Cold War Goes Hot from Compass Games, and that is coming out in March. And then Aaron Armour also coming out from Compass Games, and that is going to be sometime, I think, third or fourth quarter of this year, correct?
I hope third quarter. I really hope third quarter.
Yeah.
But the challenge is those scenarios are ready to be published. They are balanced and tested when they are balanced and tested.
Yeah.
So I let my play testing tell me when the game is ready, not anything else.
Sure. Well, that sounds really great, and looking forward definitely to both games. But thanks a lot, Bruce. Really appreciate you taking the time to come in and sit with us and talk about this game and give us a rundown on what the changes are and what to be excited about. And there's a lot to be excited about for both NATO, The Cold War Goes Hot, and Air and Armor, which are coming up this year. Like I said, NATO in March, and later in the year will be Air and Armor. But once again, Bruce, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you coming in tonight.
Mo, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about this. I've enjoyed the conversation immensely.
Absolutely, me too. And, hey, we can always text back and forth and call anytime we have questions or want to discuss any more. But also thanks to the audience for tuning in tonight and participating. Really appreciate that as well. And that'll conclude the interview today with Bruce Maxwell from the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.